For decades, American companies have looked outside of the U.S. to employ foreign workers at a fraction of the cost of their American counterparts. A recent article published by Axios sheds light on how some of these companies are not only outsourcing their jobs, but forcing the workers to train their foreign replacements. Joining me now is Steph Kite. She is a reporter for Axios and the author of that article. Steph, thanks very much for being with us. AT&T is set to outsource as many as 3,000 U.S.-based jobs this year. Outsourcing, as we know, is common in American business. So why is this so controversial? And what's going to happen to these employees?
I think one reason why this case in particular is so controversial and one reason why a lot of people are upset about it is that many felt that President Trump was going to do something about this business model. As you said, this is something that's been ongoing for a long time. Many of the biggest U.S. companies have at one point outsourced or used certain visa programs to bring in cheaper labor from outside the U.S. and in many cases to replace U.S. workers. But of course, President Trump has often said that he stands for the American worker and has long opposed these kinds of policies and these kinds of practices, but he's remained pretty silent on this particular form of outsourcing and using H-1B visas and other types of visas to replace U.S. workers with their cheaper counterparts.
Well, is AT&T doing anything to provide these employees with future work? And is there any sort of compensation for the termination of their jobs?
Well, the AT&T spokesperson told me that they do intend to try to help some of these people where possible find jobs. Many of the workers who have been impacted who I spoke to told me that they were told that they were not allowed to apply for other jobs internally at AT&T. And the way this process works is oftentimes these big companies such as AT&T will sign contracts with big outsourcing companies like Accenture and other similar companies. Many of these companies have high numbers of H-1B visas, and some are based overseas. And what happens is many of these current U.S. AT&T workers will be transferred to be employees at these outsourcing companies. So they're offered a job, even though it's not at the same company. So they're, in a sense, the way many explain to me is they're forced out of AT&T. They're fired without pension or without any other kinds of help, but offered this job at this outsourcing company. But that job is really only a part of the contract. And for many of these cases, that job is only guaranteed for a year, after which they're let go. And that's kind of the best case scenario. And one thing that was interesting when I was talking to these workers who have been impacted is a lot of them really loved working for AT&T. They loved their job. They wanted to make the company better. And part of them were just really sad that they had to leave the company. Many were AT&T employees for over a decade, sometimes 2 decades. They had really dedicated their lives to the company, and they felt abused that they would be then pushed to this outsourcing company, and in many cases forced to train the very people who would be replacing them. And in many cases, they found that the people that would be replacing them were foreigners who often didn't really understand the job they were coming into.
Well, last year, AT&T announced partnerships with several companies known for outsourcing their workforce, including IBM, Accenture, and Amdocs. How are lawmakers working to keep American-based jobs stateside in the coming years?
This is something that actually has relatively broad bipartisan support and has over the past few years. This is an issue that both Republicans and Democrats on the Hill have spoken out against. There is even some legislation that has been offered on a bipartisan basis. But these kinds of bills and this legislation doesn't tend to get very far. I think a lot of people see this as a little bit nuanced, and especially on the immigration side of things when looking at H-1B visas and worker-based visas, it's hard to get a lot of momentum around some of these issues. And in another case, many of these tech companies, these big businesses, big companies that are important to the U.S. economy really do rely on these practices, and they have a lot of weight in this fight as well.
And what industries do we see this trend impacting the most?
It is often in telecommunications and similar to AT&T. We've also seen it with Bank of America. And one of the most notable cases was in 2016 with Disney. When Disney, there was reporting by the New York Times about Disney's own outsourcing and bringing in foreigners on these visas who were willing to work for less than American workers, and then having these American workers train the replacements. And that was one of the big cases that really was brought to light. And one thing that's tricky about these kinds of contracts and these practices is that very little of this is disclosed publicly. Most of this is done behind closed doors with contracts that are hard to get access to. So even in the AT&T case, while we were able to piece together a general number, it was hard to really get an idea of the exact number of how many people this was going to impact. Based on my reporting and talking to some people who had seen some documents, we had a good estimate that it was in the thousands, but a lot of this is kept very secret, which makes it difficult for us to really see the extent of these practices.
Well, in 2018, the president denied nearly a third of H-1B visas for foreigners who were attempting to come to the United States for working purposes. IBM, Accenture, and Amdocs are all in the top 10 companies requesting foreigners on working visas. Can you explain exactly what an H-1B visa is and how this impacts the U.S. workforce?
An H-1B visa is a high-skilled work visa that's typically used for high-skilled technology jobs. It's a visa that's really important to the U.S. economy. And even the people I spoke to who have been impacted negatively by an abuse of this visa said that they do think the H-1B visa is an important part of the U.S. economy. And so no one's saying that the H-1B visa as a whole needs to be done away with. But many see companies taking advantage of this visa and taking advantage of the system and using it for something that it's not meant to be. For example, taking phone calls as a tech support person, many would say, isn't the actual job that an H-1B visa is supposed to help fill, that those visas are supposed to be for higher skilled jobs at a higher level. And another thing that most people, the biggest thing that most people have problems with the H-1B visa system is that it doesn't always ensure that the foreigners coming in are paid the same amount that Americans would be paid for that exact job. And many people say that's unfair to both the foreigners coming in and to American workers. And these are some of the issues that have been debated in Congress and some of the issues that I've spoken with people on both sides about. And that's the simplest summary of some of the issues people see with this system.
All right, Steph Kite for us. Steph, thank you very much.
Thank you.